Put her in a nursing home, my son said, as if he were suggesting we change the thermostat, not my entire life. And the doctor sitting across from me gave a small, practiced nod while sliding a neatly printed report toward my side of the table, the kind with highlighted sections and polite words that all meant the same thing. She's declining. She's forgetful. She's no longer capable. And I noticed the signature at the bottom before I even read the diagnosis, my name written in a careful imitation of my own handwriting, close enough to pass at a glance, wrong enough that I felt it settle cold in my chest. But I didn't say a word, not when Daniel avoided my eyes, not when Chloe reached over and squeezed his hand like they had just made a difficult but necessary decision. I simply folded my hands in my lap and let the silence stretch, because after 71 years, you learn that people reveal more when you give them space, and what they revealed in that moment wasn't concern. It was relief, the kind that comes when a problem is about to be neatly removed. That night, I stood alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen I had spent decades filling with Sunday dinners and birthday cakes, and I picked up a mug only to set it back down again, as if I'd forgotten why I'd reached for it. I practiced the hesitation, the slight confusion, the pause before speaking, and the next morning when Chloe asked me what day it was, I answered wrong on purpose, watched her eyes flicker with something sharp and satisfied. By noon, I was sitting in a quiet office across from Harrison Cole, the only man left who still spoke to me like I was fully present, fully aware, fully in control, and I told him everything without raising my voice, without dramatics, just the facts laid out clean and steady, the report, the signature, the plan they thought I didn't understand. He listened, then nodded once, slow and deliberate, and that was all it took. By 3 o'clock the papers were in motion, assets reassigned, accounts sealed, ownership transferred into a structure they couldn't touch, couldn't argue with, couldn't undo. And by the time I returned home, Daniel and Chloe were in the living room, speaking in low voices that stopped the second I walked in. "Mom," he said carefully, like I might break if he used the wrong tone, "we've been thinking about what's best for you." And I smiled, soft and agreeable, the kind of smile they expected from someone who didn't understand what was happening. And I nodded as if I trusted him, as if I hadn't already decided exactly how this would end, because they thought I was losing my mind, and that was the only mistake they needed to make. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had somewhere to be, but because the house had changed. The silence felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. And for a moment, I lay still in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of a car passing by, grounding myself in the ordinary before the performance began again. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, Chloe was already there, scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee in hand. She looked up with that same careful expression she had worn the night before, polite, patient, measured. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, her voice soft in a way that felt rehearsed. I paused just long enough before responding, letting my eyes drift briefly to the window, as if searching for something I had forgotten. "Good morning, dear," I answered, deliberately leaving a small gap where her name should have been. And I saw it then, that flicker again, the quiet confirmation she was looking for. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his tie slightly crooked, his movements rushed, but his eyes alert, watching me more closely than he ever had before. "Mom, did you sleep okay?" he asked, and I tilted my head as if considering the question too long. "I think so," I said slowly. "It is Thursday, right?" It was not Thursday, and we all knew it, but neither of them corrected me immediately. They exchanged a glance instead, quick and subtle, the kind that carries entire conversations without a single word. And in that glance I saw their certainty growing, their plan solidifying. They believed the report now, believed the version of me they had already decided to see. I moved through the morning carefully, each action measured, each hesitation intentional. I opened the cabinet and stood there for a second too long before taking out a plate. I poured coffee and forgot to drink it. I asked Daniel the same question twice about his work schedule, and each time he answered with a patience that felt less like kindness and more like confirmation. By late morning, Chloe suggested we sit down to go over a few things, her words wrapped in concern but lined with purpose. She placed a folder on the dining table, the same table where birthdays had been celebrated and holidays shared, now cleared of everything but paperwork, neat, organized, clinical. We just want to make sure everything is taken care of for you, she said, sliding the folder closer to me, and I looked at it without reaching, letting my fingers rest in my lap as if I had forgotten what to do next. What is it? I asked, my voice quiet, uncertain. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Just some documents, Mom. Nothing complicated. It is about making things easier, safer. Safer for whom? I wondered, but I did not ask. Instead, I nodded slowly, letting my hand move toward the folder before stopping halfway. As if distracted by a thought I could not quite hold on to, I might need some time, I murmured, and Chloe was quick to respond. Of course, Margaret. Take all the time you need. But there was a tightness in her smile now, a hint of impatience beneath the surface. They were close. They could feel it, the finish line of their careful plan. What they did not know was that while they were watching me pretend to forget, every detail around me was becoming sharper, clearer, more defined. The sound of their voices, the rhythm of their breathing, the exact moment Daniel looked at the folder instead of at me. The way Chloe's fingers tapped lightly against the table when she thought I was not paying attention. I saw all of it, stored all of it, because losing your voice is one thing, losing your awareness is another, and I had done neither. By early afternoon, Daniel stepped outside to take a call, leaving Chloe and me alone in the quiet house. She stood by the window, arms crossed loosely, watching me with a softness that did not quite reach her eyes. We are only trying to help you, she said gently, and I looked up at her, letting my expression soften just enough to match hers. I know, I replied, my voice steady beneath the surface. You have always been very thoughtful. She smiled at that, satisfied, reassured, and turned away. And in that moment, as the light shifted across the room and settled on the folder still unopened in front of me, I realized something simple and certain. They were no longer hiding what they wanted, and they no longer believed I could stop them. And that was exactly where I needed them to be. The house settled into a strange rhythm over the next 2 days, quieter on the surface, but underneath there was movement, quiet conversations that stopped when I entered the room, doors that closed a little too quickly, and I began to notice how often Chloe checked her phone when she thought I was not looking, how Daniel stayed up later than usual, his voice low behind the study door, and I made sure to move slower, to pause in doorways as if I had forgotten where I was going, giving them time to reveal what they thought I could no longer see. On the third morning, Chloe suggested we schedule a special appointment, her tone light but deliberate. Just a routine evaluation, she said, placing a hand gently on my shoulder, and I nodded as if the words had to travel a longer distance to reach me. If you think that is best, I replied, watching the relief settle into her posture. Later that afternoon, I found the confirmation email printed and left carelessly on the kitchen counter, as if they had forgotten to hide it, or perhaps they believed I would not understand it even if I saw it. The words were clear: cognitive assessment, legal capacity review, and a time set for Friday morning at 10:30. I traced the edge of the paper with my finger, then let my hand fall away slowly when I heard footsteps approaching. Chloe walked in, her smile quick, almost automatic. Oh, I was looking for that, she said, picking up the paper, and I tilted my head slightly. Looking for what? I asked, and she hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. Nothing important, Margaret, just some paperwork. I nodded, letting my gaze drift past her as if I had already lost interest. But inside, everything sharpened, every detail locking into place. That evening, Daniel sat across from me in the living room, the television playing softly in the background, though neither of us was watching it. Mom, he began, his voice careful again. We just want to make sure you are safe, that everything is taken care of properly. I looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, then smiled faintly. You have always taken good care of things, I said, and he seemed to relax at that, leaning back slightly as if reassured, as if the conversation had gone exactly the way he expected. What he did not realize was that I was not agreeing with him. I was observing him, memorizing the way his shoulders dropped, the way his hands stopped fidgeting when he believed he had control. The next morning I left the house earlier than usual, telling Chloe I was going for a short walk. She offered to come with me, her concern immediate, almost too eager, but I waved her off gently. I think I remember the way, I said with a small smile, and she let me go, standing in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. Watching, always watching. I took the long route, past the park, past the grocery store, until I reached the quiet office building where Harrison Cole was already waiting. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He listened as I described the appointment, the documents, the pattern that had become impossible to ignore, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. If they succeed in that evaluation, they can petition for control, he said, financial, legal, everything. I nodded once, because I already knew. I had seen it in the way they spoke to me, the way they had begun to rewrite who I was while I was still standing in front of them. Then we do not give them that chance, I replied, my voice steady, clearer here than it had been in my own home for days. And Harrison studied me for a moment before giving a small, approving nod. We move quickly, he said, very quickly. By the time I returned home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Daniel and Chloe were at the table again. The folder open now, more papers added. Their voices low but urgent. They looked up when I entered, their expressions shifting instantly into concern, into patience, into that careful kindness they had perfected. Did you have a good walk? Chloe asked, and I paused in the doorway, letting my hand rest lightly against the frame as if I needed the support. I think so, I said slowly. Then after a brief pause, it was nice outside, and as I moved further into the room, I could feel it, their certainty, their quiet belief that everything was already decided, that I was already slipping beyond my own control, and I let them believe it, because the more convinced they became, the less they would see what was already happening just beyond their reach. The next day moved with a quiet precision that only I seemed to notice. Every minute measured not by clocks but by intention. I woke before the sun again, dressed slowly, choosing the same soft sweater I had worn the day before, as if repetition itself could reinforce the image they had already accepted. When I stepped into the hallway, I paused, placing my hand lightly against the wall as though I needed to steady myself. And I waited just long enough for Chloe to appear at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes lifting immediately, alert, observant, always watching. Do you need help? She asked, her voice gentle but quick, and I shook my head after a brief delay. No, I just needed a moment, I said, letting my words come slightly uneven. She smiled, satisfied again, and turned back toward the kitchen. That smile told me everything. It told me she believed I was slipping further, that whatever doubts she may have had were now gone, and that certainty made her careless in ways she did not realize. Breakfast was quiet, the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of things unsaid. Daniel scanned something on his tablet, while Chloe moved around the kitchen with small, efficient motions. Neither of them asked me many questions anymore. They no longer needed confirmation. They believed they already had it, and that belief gave me space to think, to watch, to prepare. Later that morning, Chloe reminded me about the appointment scheduled for Friday. She spoke slowly, clearly, as if explaining something to a child. It is just to make sure everything is documented properly, she said, placing a hand over mine for emphasis. I looked down at her hand for a second longer than necessary before lifting my gaze back to her face. Documented, I repeated softly, as if testing the word, and she nodded, encouraged, unaware that I understood it far better than she assumed. By midday, Daniel left for work, his departure quicker than usual, his goodbye distracted, and as the front door closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale, leaving Chloe and me alone in a quiet that stretched across the rooms. She took a call shortly after, stepping into the living room, her voice lowered but not low enough. I remained in the kitchen, my movements slow, deliberate, giving no indication that I was listening. Yes, Friday morning, she said, pacing lightly near the window. The doctor already reviewed the file, and once the evaluation is complete, we can move forward with the legal process. There was a pause, then a softer laugh. No, she will not understand what is happening. I set a cup down gently on the counter, careful not to make a sound. My reflection faintly visible in the window glass, still, composed, entirely present. When she returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, she offered me another one of those careful smiles. Everything all right? She asked, and I nodded slowly. I was just thinking, I said, letting the sentence trail off as if I had lost it halfway through. She did not press. She did not need to. In her mind, the outcome was already decided. That afternoon, I retreated to my room, closing the door softly behind me. And for the first time in days, I allowed my posture to shift, my shoulders straightening, my gaze sharpening as I reached for the folder Harrison had given me earlier. The documents inside were precise, final, each page representing a step already taken, accounts transferred, properties reassigned, protections in place that no simple evaluation could undo. I ran my fingers along the edge of the papers, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. This was not just a reaction anymore. It was a decision, a line drawn quietly but firmly. As the light outside began to fade, I placed the folder back into my bag and returned to the hallway, slowing my steps again before opening the door, the performance resuming without effort. By the time Daniel came home that evening, the house had returned to its careful balance. Chloe at the table, papers neatly arranged, Daniel standing beside her, both of them turning toward me with that same measured concern. "Mom, we were just talking about Friday," he said, and I nodded, letting my gaze drift briefly to the documents before returning to his face. "Friday," I repeated softly, and in that moment I saw it clearly, their confidence, their certainty that everything was already in motion, that nothing could stop what they had set in place. And I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to settle at the edge of my thoughts, because while they were preparing to prove I could not take care of myself, I had already ensured that there would be nothing left for them to take. Friday arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost rehearsed, the kind of morning where even the sunlight seemed softer, filtered through the curtains as if the house itself was holding its breath. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple outfit that made me look smaller, less certain, the version of myself they had already accepted. And when I stepped into the kitchen, both Daniel and Chloe were already there, waiting, their movements slower than usual, deliberate, as though they were handling something fragile. "We have plenty of time," Daniel said, checking his watch, though we both knew they had planned every minute of this day. I nodded, letting my gaze drift toward the window. "That is good," I replied, my voice quiet, measured. Chloe handed me a cup of coffee, her fingers brushing mine briefly. "Just take it easy today," she said. And I noticed how her tone carried a hint of reassurance, meant more for herself than for me. We left the house together a little before 10, Daniel driving, Chloe in the passenger seat, and I sat in the back, watching the familiar streets pass by like scenes from a life that no longer belonged to me. The drive was silent except for the occasional exchange between them, small details about the appointment, directions, timing, all of it carefully controlled. When we arrived at the clinic, everything was exactly as I expected. Clean, neutral, efficient, the kind of place where decisions are made quietly but carry weight far beyond the room. A receptionist greeted us with a polite smile, her eyes moving quickly from Daniel to Chloe before settling on me with a practiced warmth. "Margaret, we will take good care of you," she said, and I smiled faintly, as if reassured, as if I needed to be told that. They guided me into a small office where a doctor sat behind a desk, reviewing a file that I knew already contained a version of me that did not exist. He looked up, offering a calm, professional expression. "We are just going to have a simple conversation today," he said, and I nodded, settling into the chair with a slight hesitation, letting my hands rest loosely in my lap. The questions began simply enough: dates, names, small details that I answered with just enough uncertainty to confirm what they wanted to see. I paused before responding, corrected myself once or twice, allowed my voice to waver at the right moments, and each time I did, I saw it, the subtle shift in his posture, the quiet notes he made on the paper in front of him. Outside the room, through the glass panel, I could see Chloe and Daniel waiting, their silhouettes still, their attention fixed. They were watching the outcome unfold in real time, believing that each answer I gave was bringing them closer to control. What they did not see was the way the doctor's questions gradually changed, becoming more structured, more precise, and how I followed them just closely enough to remain believable, just far enough to maintain the illusion. When the evaluation ended, the doctor thanked me and asked me to wait outside, and as I stepped into the hallway, Chloe was already on her feet, her expression carefully composed but unable to hide the anticipation beneath it. "How did it go?" she asked softly, and I tilted my head slightly, letting a small, uncertain smile form. "I think it was fine," I said, and that was enough for her. Enough to reinforce everything she believed. The doctor spoke with them briefly while I sat a few feet away, my hands folded, my gaze lowered, the picture of quiet compliance. I did not need to hear every word to understand what was being said. I could see it in the way Daniel nodded, in the way Chloe's shoulders relaxed, in the faint satisfaction that settled over both of them as they returned to me. "Everything is going to be taken care of," Daniel said, his voice steady, confident, and I looked up at him, meeting his eyes for just a fraction longer than usual before lowering my gaze again. "I am glad," I replied softly, and as we walked back to the car, I felt it clearly. Their certainty had reached its peak. They believed the process was complete, that the final steps would follow naturally, that there was nothing left for me to do. And as I settled into the back seat once more, watching the clinic disappear behind us, I allowed that belief to remain untouched, because the more convinced they were that everything had been decided, the less prepared they would be for what was already waiting for them at home. The ride home felt shorter than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because the outcome had already settled into the space between us. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel, his posture relaxed in a way I had not seen in weeks, while Chloe occasionally glanced at him with a quiet smile that spoke of something shared, something finished. I sat in the back seat with my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the passing streets blur into one another, allowing my reflection in the window to look smaller, distant, as if I were slowly fading from the life I had once held together. When we pulled into the driveway, Daniel turned off the engine but did not move right away. He looked at Chloe, then back at me through the rearview mirror. "We're going to take care of everything, Mom," he said, his voice calm, assured. And I nodded after a slight pause. "I know," I replied softly, stepping out of the car with measured care. Once inside, Chloe moved quickly, more energy in her steps now. She went straight to the dining table where the documents were already arranged, adding new pages, aligning them carefully, preparing for what she believed would be the final stage. Daniel joined her, loosening his tie, his movements lighter, almost relieved. "The doctor seemed confident," he said quietly, and Chloe nodded. "It is just a matter of paperwork now," she answered, and I remained near the doorway for a moment, letting my hand rest lightly against the wall as if I needed the support, giving them the space to speak freely, to reveal everything without hesitation. Later that afternoon, Chloe approached me with a folder, her tone gentle but purposeful. "Margaret, there are a few things we need you to sign, just to make sure everything is in order," she said, placing the folder in front of me. I looked at it, without reaching immediately, letting my eyes move across the pages as if the words were difficult to follow. "Sign?" I repeated quietly, and she smiled, encouraging. "Yes, just routine, nothing complicated." Daniel stood beside her, his presence steady, expectant. I lifted the pen slowly, holding it for a second longer than necessary, then lowered it back onto the table. "Maybe later," I murmured, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of tension pass between them, subtle. But there, Chloe recovered quickly, her smile returning. "Of course, whenever you feel ready," she said, but the rhythm had shifted, even, if only slightly. That evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, I moved through each room with deliberate slowness, pausing at the small details that had once defined my life. The framed photographs, the worn edges of furniture, the familiar arrangement of objects that now felt like they belonged to a story already finished. In my room, I closed the door softly behind me and allowed the stillness to deepen. The performance dropped away as I reached for my bag, opening it to reveal the documents Harrison had prepared, everything completed, every step finalized, the trust established, the accounts secured, the ownership transferred beyond reach. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, holding the papers without reading them again, because I did not need to. The decisions had already been made, not in haste, not in anger, but in clarity. When I returned to the hallway, my steps slowed once more, the mask settling back into place effortlessly. Daniel was in the living room, reviewing something on his tablet, while Chloe stood by the table, reorganizing the same stack of papers she had already arranged twice before. They looked up as I entered, their expressions shifting instantly into that careful concern. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, and I nodded, offering a faint smile. "I was just thinking," I said softly, and Chloe stepped closer, her voice reassuring. There is nothing to worry about. We are handling everything. I met her gaze briefly, then lowered mine, allowing the moment to pass without resistance, because that was what they expected, what they needed to believe. And as the evening moved quietly toward night, I could feel it clearly. Their certainty had returned, stronger now, reinforced by the day, by the evaluation, by the signatures they believed were only hours away. They were preparing for a future where I would no longer have a voice, no longer have control, and I let that future exist in their minds untouched, because the reality waiting beneath it had already been set in motion, and by the time they realized it, there would be nothing left for them to take. The following morning unfolded with a strange kind of calm, the kind that settles in just before something irreversible happens. I moved through the house with the same measured pace, the same careful pauses, but inside everything had already shifted. Daniel left early for work, his confidence quiet but unmistakable, as if the outcome of the past day had already secured what he wanted. Chloe remained behind, her energy sharper now, more focused. She did not watch me as closely anymore, and that told me everything. She believed the process was nearly complete, believed I was no longer capable of interfering, and that belief made her careless. By mid-morning, she was back at the dining table, papers spread out again, adding notes, making calls, her voice low but no longer cautious. Yes, we will have everything finalized soon, she said into the phone, pacing slowly across the room. The evaluation went exactly as expected. I stood in the hallway just out of sight, my hand resting lightly against the wall, listening without appearing to listen, allowing her words to settle clearly in my mind. When she ended the call, I stepped forward, just slightly, enough for her to notice me, and she turned with that same soft smile, though now it carried something else, a quiet sense of victory. "Margaret, you should sit down. You look tired," she said, and I nodded slowly, lowering myself into the chair across from her. "I might be a little tired," I admitted, letting my voice soften just enough. She placed the folder in front of me again, more organized this time, more final. "We can take care of this now. It will make everything easier," she said, and this time I did not hesitate as long. I picked up the pen, held it, let my hand tremble just slightly before placing it back down again. "I cannot seem to focus," I murmured, and for a moment I saw it, that flicker of irritation she could not quite hide. It was small, gone almost instantly, but it was there. She was ready for this to be over, ready for control to shift completely, and my delay, however small, disrupted that expectation. "That is okay," she said quickly, her tone adjusting, smoothing over the moment. "We can try again later," and I nodded, lowering my gaze as if relieved. The rest of the day passed with a careful distance between us. She made a few more calls, quieter now, more deliberate, while I moved through the house in the same slow rhythm, reinforcing the image they had already accepted. By late afternoon, Daniel returned home, earlier than usual, his expression composed but alert. He went straight to Chloe, their voices low, urgent again, and I remained in the living room, seated quietly, watching the reflection of their movements in the darkened television screen. Fragments of conversation reached me, words like timing, final steps, next week, and I could feel the urgency building beneath their calm. They were close, so close they could almost see it, that future where everything belonged to them, where I was no longer part of the equation. When they finally approached me together, their expressions aligned, their tone unified. It felt rehearsed, controlled. "Mom," Daniel began, sitting across from me, "we think it would be best to move forward with everything soon, just to make sure you are taken care of properly." I looked at him for a moment, letting my expression remain soft, uncertain, then nodded slowly. "If that is what you think is best," I said, and that was all they needed. That small agreement, that quiet surrender they believed was real. They exchanged a brief glance, relief passing between them like a signal. Chloe stepped forward, placing her hand gently on my shoulder. "We are doing this for you," she said, and I allowed my posture to remain still beneath her touch, neither accepting nor rejecting it. Because in that moment, what they believed no longer mattered. Everything that needed to be done had already been done, every document secured, every decision finalized. Every path they intended to take already closed without their knowledge. And as the evening settled in, the house once again filled with that quiet anticipation. I could feel it clearly. They were preparing for an ending, but not the one they thought they were writing. The next day began with a quiet sense of finality, the kind that settles into a space when decisions have already been made and only the formality remains. Chloe moved through the house with a new kind of energy, not rushed, but purposeful, as if every step she took was leading towards something she had been waiting for. Daniel stayed home that morning, something he rarely did, his presence steady and watchful. And I understood immediately. They did not want to risk any delay now, not when. Everything felt so close to being complete. Breakfast was brief, almost silent, their attention elsewhere, focused on the documents waiting on the table, the calls they still needed to make, the steps they believed would finalize everything. I sat quietly, my hands resting in my lap, letting the stillness stretch, allowing them to move ahead without resistance. Because resistance was no longer necessary. By mid-morning, Chloe placed the folder in front of me once again, this time thicker, more official. "We just need to finish this today," she said, her voice soft but firm, and Daniel stood just behind her, his posture supportive, reinforcing her words without speaking them. I looked at the pages slowly, letting my eyes move across the lines as if the words were slipping away from me. "There is a lot here," I murmured, and Chloe nodded quickly. "It is just standard, nothing complicated. We will help you through it," she said, sliding the pen toward me. And this time I did not pull away immediately. I picked it up, held it between my fingers, letting my hand hover just above the paper. A small pause, long enough for them to lean forward slightly, watching, waiting, believing this was the moment everything would finally fall into place. Then I lowered the pen, not to sign, but to rest it gently on the table. "I think I need a little more time," I said quietly. And for the first time, the tension did not disappear as quickly. Daniel stepped closer, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. "Mom, it is important that we take care of this now," he said, and I looked up at him, holding his gaze just a fraction longer than I had before, long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. Then I nodded slowly, lowering my eyes. Again, "All right," I whispered, and this time, I signed, not the documents they believed would give them control, but the ones I had already prepared, the ones already finalized, the ones that changed nothing about what they thought was happening, but ensured everything about what actually was. Chloe watched closely, her expression focused, satisfied as each signature appeared on the page. Daniel exhaled softly, a quiet release of tension he had been carrying for days. They believed it was done now, believed the final step had been taken, that everything they had planned was now secured, and I allowed that belief to settle, untouched, because correcting them would have served no purpose. After the papers were collected and neatly stacked, Chloe placed them carefully back into the folder, her movements precise, almost reverent. "We will take care of the rest," she said, and Daniel nodded. "Everything is going to be handled," he added, and I offered a faint smile, the kind they had come to expect, the kind that confirmed everything they already believed. The rest of the day passed in a quiet that felt heavier than before, not with uncertainty, but with completion. They moved through the house with a sense of ownership that had not been there before, discussing small changes, future plans, adjustments that assumed I would no longer be part of the decisions. I listened without reacting, without interrupting, because there was nothing left to say. By evening, the light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the rooms, and I sat in the living room, watching those shadows stretch and shift, knowing that what they saw as the end was only the beginning of something they had not prepared for, because while they believed they had secured everything they wanted, the truth was already in motion, waiting just beyond the moment they thought would define everything. And by the time they realized it, the outcome would no longer be theirs to control. The house felt different that evening, not louder, not quieter, but settled in a way that only comes when something irreversible has already taken place. Daniel moved through the rooms with a confidence that bordered on ownership, opening cabinets, adjusting small things that had remained untouched for years, while Chloe sat at the dining table, reviewing the documents once more, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages as if confirming their reality. I remained in the living room, seated in The same chair I had occupied for decades, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. Watching the reflection of their movements in the darkened window, neither of them noticed how still I had become, not the kind of stillness they had come to expect, but something quieter, steadier, complete. "We should start planning the move," Chloe said at one point, her voice light, practical, as if discussing something routine. Daniel nodded. "The sooner the better," he replied, and I let the words settle into the space without responding, because responding would have required them to see me, and they no longer did. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the front door, not loud, not urgent, just precise, measured, the kind of knock that carries intention. Daniel frowned slightly, glancing toward Chloe before standing. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked, and she shook her head, her expression tightening just enough to betray uncertainty. He walked to the door, opening it without hesitation, and for a moment, there was silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to shift everything. When he stepped back, Harrison Cole entered the house with the same calm presence he always carried, a leather folder in his hand, his eyes moving briefly across the room before settling on me. "Good evening, Margaret," he said, and I inclined my head slightly. "Good evening, Harrison," I replied, my voice steady, clear, without the hesitation they had grown accustomed to. Daniel's posture stiffened immediately, confusion flickering across his face. "What is this?" he asked, his tone controlled but strained. Harrison did not answer him directly. Instead, he stepped further into the room, placing the folder on the dining table with a quiet precision. Chloe stood quickly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "We were not expecting anyone," she said, her voice sharper now, and Harrison met her gaze calmly. "I am here on Margaret's behalf," he replied, and in that moment, something shifted, something small but undeniable. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in days, and I met his eyes without lowering mine, without softening my expression. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Harrison opened the folder, sliding a set of documents across the table. "All assets have already been transferred into a protected trust," he said evenly. Effective immediately, Chloe's hand moved instinctively toward the papers, her fingers trembling just slightly as she flipped through them, her expression changing with each page, confusion giving way to disbelief. Daniel stepped closer, reading over her shoulder, his breath catching in a way I had not heard since he was a child. "That is not possible," he said quietly, and Harrison remained still, composed. "It is already done," he replied. I rose slowly from my chair, not out of necessity, but because it felt like the right moment. The room seemed to adjust around that movement, as if everything had been waiting for it. "You said you wanted to take care of everything," I said, my voice calm, measured. "I have already done that." Daniel stared at me, searching for something familiar, something he could still recognize. But there was nothing left for him to hold on to. Chloe closed the folder abruptly, her composure slipping. "You cannot just do this," she said. But her voice lacked the certainty it had carried all day. I looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet clarity that required no explanation. "It is already done," I repeated, and this time, the words settled differently, heavier, final. The room fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of realization, the kind that arrives when there is nothing left to change. I turned toward the hallway, my steps steady, unhurried, and for the first time since this began, I did not slow them, did not hesitate, did not perform, because there was nothing left to pretend. Behind me, I could feel their confusion, their disbelief, the careful structure they had built unraveling without a single raised voice. And as I reached the doorway, I paused briefly, not to look back, but simply to let the moment settle completely, because they had believed everything was already decided. They had believed the ending belonged to them, and they were not entirely wrong. It just was never the ending they thought it would be.